Imagine this. You're just trying to close your own driveway gate after a long day minding your business, when suddenly a stranger decides your simple action is a threat. Sounds unbelievable, right? But for one man, this wasn't just a hypothetical scenario. It was his reality. What started as an ordinary evening quickly spiraled into a situation that would leave everyone involved stunned, angry, and questioning how something so absurd could even happen. This is the story of a man who was simply trying to live his life, a woman who saw danger where there was none, and the shocking twist that no one saw coming. It all began on a quiet suburban street, the kind of place where neighbors wave hello, and kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. But beneath the surface of this peaceful community, tensions were simmering, tensions that would soon boil over in the most unexpected way. Our main character, let's call him Marcus, had lived in this neighborhood for years. He was the kind of guy who kept to himself, always polite, always respectful. But on this particular day, something as simple as closing his driveway gate would turn his world upside down. Enter Karen. Now, we've all heard the stories, the viral videos, the memes, the endless jokes. But this wasn't just a meme. This was real life. Karen lived a few houses down from Marcus, and while they'd never really spoken, she'd always seemed curious. Some might say nosy. She was the type to peer out her window at the sound of a car door closing, the kind who always seemed to have an opinion about what everyone else was doing. And on this day, her curiosity would take a dark turn. As Marcus stepped out of his car and walked toward his driveway gate, he noticed Karen standing on the sidewalk, watching him. He gave her a polite nod, thinking nothing of it. But as he reached for the gate, something in her demeanor shifted. Her eyes narrowed, her posture stiffened, and before he knew it, she was marching toward him, her phone already in her hand. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. Marcus, confused, replied, "I'm closing my gate. Is there a problem?" But Karen wasn't having it. "Your gate? This isn't your property," she snapped, her finger already hovering over the call button on her phone. Marcus tried to explain, to reason with her, but it was no use. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Marcus found himself face to face with the police, trying to prove that he wasn't a criminal, just a man closing his own driveway. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. As the officers began to investigate, they uncovered something that would change everything, something Karen never could have anticipated. But before we get to that, let's rewind a bit. Let's talk about how this neighborhood, once so quiet and unassuming, became the stage for a confrontation that would expose deeper issues lurking beneath the surface. Let's talk about Marcus, a man who just wanted to live his life in peace, and Karen, a woman who saw a threat where there was none. And let's talk about the moment when everything changed, the moment when Marcus discovered something that would turn the tables in the most unexpected way. But here's the thing. This story isn't just about a confrontation. It's about assumptions, about the way we see the world and the people in it. It's about what happens when fear takes over, when judgment clouds our ability to see the truth. And it's about the consequences of those actions, consequences that no one could have predicted. So what did Marcus find out? What was the shocking twist that left Karen speechless and the police scrambling to make sense of it all? Well, that's where things get really interesting. But before we dive into the heart of the story, let's take a moment to understand how we got here. Because sometimes the most ordinary moments can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. And sometimes the truth is stranger and more revealing than anyone could have imagined. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. What happens? Next, we'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about neighbors, assumptions, and the power of the truth. But for now, let's just say this. Karen thought she was in control. She thought she knew exactly what was happening. But she had no idea what Marcus was about to discover, and neither do you. To truly understand how this situation escalated the way it did, we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Marcus had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade. He was a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself, but he was also someone who took pride in his home. His driveway gate wasn't just a functional thing. It was a symbol of the life he'd built for himself. He'd installed it a few years ago after a series of package thefts in the area, and it had become a routine part of his day to open and close it. To him, it was just another way to protect what was his. But to Karen, it was something else entirely. Karen, on the other hand, had only been in the neighborhood for a couple of years. She'd moved in after her divorce, looking for a fresh start in a place that felt safe and predictable. But Karen wasn't just looking for safety. She was looking for control. She was the kind of person who needed to know everything that was happening around her, who needed to feel like she had a say in how things were run. And while most of the neighbors tolerated her quirks, there was always an undercurrent of tension whenever she was around. She had a way of turning small things into big deals, and this time was no different. The day of the incident started like any other. Marcus had come home from work, exhausted but looking forward to a quiet evening. He parked his car, grabbed his bag, and walked toward the gate. It was a routine he'd done 1,000 times before, but this time, something felt off. He noticed Karen standing on the sidewalk, her arms crossed, watching him with an intensity that made him uneasy. He tried to brush it off, telling himself she was just being her usual nosy self. But when he reached for the gate, she suddenly snapped. "Excuse me," she shouted, her voice cutting through the quiet street. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus froze, confused. "I'm closing my gate," he said calmly, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. But Karen wasn't having it. "Your gate. This isn't your property," she insisted, her tone sharp and accusatory. Marcus blinked, trying to process what was happening. "Ma'am, I've lived here for years. This is my house. This is my gate." But Karen wasn't listening. She was already dialing 911, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and indignation, as she reported a suspicious man trying to break into private property. Marcus could only stand there, stunned, as she described him to the dispatcher in terms that made his stomach churn. He tried to reason with her, to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, but she refused to back down. By the time the police arrived, the situation had escalated to a point where Marcus felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. The officers, to their credit, tried to handle the situation as calmly as possible. They asked Marcus for identification, which he provided without hesitation. They asked Karen to explain her side of the story, which she did with a level of drama that made Marcus wonder if she'd missed her calling as an actress. But as the officers began to piece together what had happened, something didn't add up. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, turning to Karen, "are you sure this isn't his property?" Karen hesitated for a moment, her confidence wavering. "Well, I've never seen him before," she stammered. "And he was acting so suspiciously, closing that gate like he was trying to hide something." The officer glanced at Marcus, then back at Karen. "Ma'am, this is his house. He's lived here for years." For a moment it seemed like the situation might de-escalate, but then Karen doubled down. "How do I know that?" she demanded. "How do I know he's not lying? He could be anyone." The officers exchanged a look, clearly frustrated but trying to remain professional. They asked Marcus a few more questions, trying to verify his story, but it was clear that Karen's accusations had planted a seed of doubt, and then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more complicated, Marcus noticed something. Something small, something almost insignificant, but something that made his blood run cold. As he stood there trying to keep his composure, he caught a glimpse of something in Karen's hand. It was a piece of paper, crumpled and partially hidden, but he could just make out the words "property line dispute" scrawled across the top. His mind raced. What was that about? Why did she have it? And more importantly, what did it have to do with him? Before he could say anything, one of the officers turned to him. "Sir, we're going to need to take a closer look at this. Can you come with us?" Marcus nodded, his heart pounding, but his eyes never left Karen. She was avoiding his gaze now, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. As the officers led Marcus away, He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. What was Karen hiding? And why had she been so quick to call the police on him? The questions swirled in his mind. But there were no answers. Not yet. Back at the house, Karen stood on the sidewalk watching as the police car drove away. Her hands were shaking, and she clutched the piece of paper tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. She knew. She'd overreacted. But there was something else. Something she couldn't quite put into words. Something that made her wonder if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in the back of the police car, his mind racing. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't, not by a long shot. And as the car turned the corner, disappearing from view, the neighborhood fell silent once again. But the tension in the air was palpable, a reminder that sometimes the quietest streets hide the loudest secrets. What happens next? What was on that piece of paper? And how will Marcus and Karen's lives be changed by what's about to unfold? The answers are coming, but for now all we can do is wait and wonder. Because in a story like this, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. As Marcus sat in the back of the police car, his mind was a whirlwind of questions. He replayed the confrontation with Karen over and over, trying to make sense of it. Why had she been so quick to accuse him? What was that piece of paper she'd been clutching? And why did it feel like there was something bigger going on here? Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The officers had been polite, but firm, telling him they needed to verify a few things before they could let him go. Marcus nodded, trying to stay calm, but inside, he was seething. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. This was about respect, about dignity, about the right to exist in his own space without being treated like a criminal. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, Karen was pacing her living room, her heart racing. She knew she'd overreacted, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been right to be suspicious. That piece of paper she'd been holding, it wasn't just some random document. It was a notice from the city, one that had arrived in her mailbox just a few days ago. It mentioned something about a property line dispute, something about a fence or a gate being in the wrong place. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, but now, as she replayed the events of the evening, she couldn't help but wonder if it was connected to Marcus. Karen wasn't a bad person, not really. She was just someone who'd been through a lot. A messy divorce, a career that had stalled, a life that felt like it was slipping out of her control. And in this new neighborhood, she'd been searching for a sense of stability, a way to feel like she belonged. But instead, she'd found herself constantly on edge, always looking for something to worry about. And tonight, that worry had found a target, Marcus. As the hours passed, the tension in the neighborhood grew. Word of the incident had spread quickly, thanks to a few nosy neighbors who'd been watching from their windows. Texts flew back and forth, rumors began to circulate, and soon the quiet street felt like it was buzzing with unease. Some people sided with Marcus, saying Karen had gone too far. Others defended her, saying she was just being cautious. But no one really knew the whole story, not yet. At the police station, Marcus was finally allowed to make a phone call. He dialed his best friend, James, who arrived within minutes. James was the kind of guy who always knew what to say, and as soon as he saw Marcus, he could tell something was seriously wrong. "What the hell happened, man?" James asked, his voice low but urgent. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's Karen," he said. "She called the cops on me for closing my own damn gate, said I was trespassing or something. And then, I don't know, man. There was this paper she had, something about a property line dispute. I think there's more to this, but I can't figure it out." James frowned, his mind racing. "A property line dispute? That doesn't make sense. You've lived there forever. Did she say anything else?" Marcus shook his head. "No, but she was acting weird, like she was hiding something. And the cops, they're treating me like I did something wrong. I just don't get it." Back at Karen's house, she was still pacing, her thoughts spiraling. She knew she needed to do something, but she wasn't sure what. Part of her wanted to call the police again, to explain herself, to make them understand why she'd been so quick to act. But another part of her was afraid of what she might find out, afraid of what Marcus might say, afraid of what this whole mess might mean for her. And then there was the paper. She unfolded it now, reading it again for what felt like the 100th time. It was a notice from the city, all right, but it wasn't just about a property line dispute. It mentioned something about a survey, about boundaries being redrawn, about a possible error in the original property lines. Karen's heart sank as she realized what this might mean. If the property lines were wrong, then maybe Marcus's gate wasn't on his property after all. Maybe it was on hers. The thought hit her like a punch to the gut. If that was true, then everything she'd done, calling the police, accusing Marcus, causing this whole scene, it was all based on a misunderstanding. But if that was true, then why hadn't the city told her sooner? Why had they sent her this vague notice without explaining what it really meant? As the night wore on, the tension in the neighborhood only grew. Marcus and James sat in the police station, trying to figure out their next move. Karen sat in her living room, staring at that piece of paper, wondering what she was supposed to do now. And outside, the street was quiet, but the air was thick, with unspoken questions, with fear, with the weight of what was still to come. What happens next? Will Marcus be able to clear his name? Will Karen come forward with the truth? And what does that piece of paper really mean for both of them? The answers are still out of reach, but one thing is certain. This story is far from over. Because in a situation like this, where fear and misunderstanding collide, the truth is often the hardest thing to find. And until it's found, the tension will only keep building, pulling everyone involved deeper into a web of secrets, lies, and unanswered questions. So what will happen when the truth finally comes to light? And who will be left standing when the dust settles? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to an uneasy silence. The events of the previous night hung heavy in the air, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Marcus had been released from the police station after hours of questioning, but the ordeal was far from over. He returned home exhausted, his mind still racing with unanswered questions. James had stayed, with him, trying to offer support, but even he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. "We need to figure out what's going on," James said as they sat in Marcus's living room. "This isn't just about Karen anymore. There's something bigger here, and we need to get to the bottom of it." Marcus nodded, but he felt stuck. How do you fight something you don't fully understand? That piece of paper Karen had been holding, it was the key to everything, but he had no idea what it said or what it meant. All he knew was that it had something to do with the property lines, and that it had sparked this whole mess. "I need to talk to her," Marcus said finally, his voice firm. "I need to look her in the eye and ask her what the hell is going on." But Karen was nowhere to be found. She hadn't left her house all morning, and when Marcus knocked on her door, there was no answer. He stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. What was she hiding, and why was she avoiding him now, after everything she'd done? Meanwhile, inside her house, Karen was a wreck. She hadn't slept all night, her mind consumed by guilt and fear. That piece of paper was still on her kitchen table, taunting her with its cryptic words. She'd tried calling the city for clarification, but all she got was a runaround. Voicemails, transfers, and vague promises that someone would get back to her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she actually knew. Had she made a huge mistake? Had she accused an innocent man of something he didn't do? The thought made her stomach churn. But Karen wasn't the only one digging for answers. Marcus and James had decided to take matters into their own hands. They started by going to the city offices, trying to get a copy of the property survey. It wasn't easy, bureaucracy never is, but after hours of waiting and arguing, they finally got what they needed. The survey was old, the lines faded and hard to read, but one thing was clear. There was a discrepancy. The property lines didn't match up with what was on record. Marcus's gate, the one he'd installed years ago, might not actually be on his property. The realization hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. If the gate wasn't on his property, then Karen's accusations, as misguided as they were, might have had some basis, in fact. But that didn't explain why she'd been so aggressive, so quick to call the police, and it didn't explain why the city had sent her that notice without explaining what it meant. There were still too many missing pieces, too many questions without answers. As the day wore on, the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Word had spread about the property line dispute, and now everyone was talking. Some neighbors sided with Marcus, saying Karen had overreacted and caused unnecessary drama. Others sided with Karen, saying she was just trying to protect her property. But no one really knew the truth, and the uncertainty only made things worse. By late afternoon, Marcus had had enough. He marched over to Karen's house again, this time with James by his side. He knocked on the door, louder this time, and called out her name. "Karen, we need to talk. This has gone on long enough." For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Karen stood there, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked like a completely different person from the confident, accusatory woman who'd confronted him the night before. I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know about the property lines. I thought you were trying to take something that wasn't yours." Marcus stared at her, his anger fading just enough to let a sliver of sympathy through. "Karen, if you had just talked to me instead of calling the police, we could have figured this out together. But now it's a mess." Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I messed up. I was scared, and I didn't think. But there's more to this, Marcus. That notice from the city, it's not just about the property lines. There's something else going on, something bigger. I don't know what it is, but I think we're both caught in the middle of it." Her words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. What did she mean by something bigger? What else was at play here? Before he could ask, Karen handed him the piece of paper. "Here, take it. Maybe you can make sense of it." Marcus took the paper, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded it. The words were still vague, but there was one line that stood out. "Pending investigation into historical property records." Historical property records? What did that mean? Marcus looked at Karen, then at James, who was standing silently beside him. None of them had the answers, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a gate or a property line. This was about something deeper, something hidden, something that had been buried for years. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the neighborhood, Marcus felt a sense of dread creeping in. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be easy. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to back down, not now, not after everything he'd been through. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And as the tension reached its peak, one question loomed larger than all the others. What would happen when the truth finally came out? Stay tuned, because the climax of this story is about to hit, and when it does, nothing will ever be the same as Marcus stood on Karen's doorstep, clutching the crumpled piece of paper. The weight of her words settled over him like a fog. "Something bigger," she had said. What could that mean? The mention of historical property records gnawed at him, but before he could press her further, Karen closed the door softly, leaving him and James standing there in the fading light. The neighborhood, usually so quiet at this hour, felt charged with an eerie energy, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Marcus and James returned to Marcus's house, the paper spread out on the kitchen table between them. They pored over every word, every line, trying to make sense of the vague language. "Pending investigation into historical property records" was the phrase that stuck out. But what did it mean? Why would the city care about something that happened years ago? And how did it connect to Marcus's gate or to Karen? James, ever the problem solver, suggested they dig deeper. If this is about historical records, Maybe it's not just about the property lines. Maybe it's about who owns what or who used to own it. Marcus frowned. What are you saying? That this land has some kind of history we don't know about? James shrugged. I don't know, man, but if the city's involved, it's gotta be serious. We need to find out more. The next morning, Marcus and James headed to the local library, where they spent hours combing through old property records, maps, and newspaper archives. At first, nothing stood out. The neighborhood had been built in the 1980s, and the records seemed straightforward. But then, tucked away in a dusty folder, they found something that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a newspaper article from the 1950s, yellowed and brittle with age. The headline read, "Family Forced Out as Neighborhood Segregation Laws Tighten." The article detailed how a black family, the Johnsons, had been forced to sell their home and land after the city implemented new zoning laws designed to push people of color out of the area. The land they'd owned, the very land where Marcus's house now stood, had been sold to a developer for a fraction of its value. The Johnsons had fought the decision, but in the end, they'd had no choice but to leave. Marcus stared at the article, his hands trembling. This is my land," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where my house is. My gate. Everything." James leaned over, reading the article again. Man, this is huge. If this is true, then the city might be trying to cover something up. Maybe that's why they sent Karen that notice. Maybe they're trying to fix something before it gets out. But Marcus wasn't so sure. If the city was investigating historical property records, did that mean they were trying to make things right? Or were they trying to bury the past even deeper? And what did Karen have to do with all of this? Was she just a pawn in a much larger game? Or did she know more than she was letting on? As they left the library, Marcus felt a mix of anger and determination. This wasn't just about a gate or property line anymore. This was about justice, about history, about the truth. He needed to talk to Karen again, but this time, he needed answers. Real answers. When they got back to the neighborhood, they found Karen sitting on her front porch, staring into the distance. She looked up as they approached, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. "I was waiting for you," she said, quietly. I think I owe you an explanation." Marcus sat down across from her, the newspaper article in his hand. "Karen, what do you know about this?" he asked, holding it up so she could see the headline. Her face went pale, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then slowly she began to tell her side of the story. "A few weeks ago I got a call from someone at the city," she said. "They told me there might be an issue with the property lines, something about a historical discrepancy. They said they were looking into it, but they didn't give me any details. Then I got that notice in the mail and I panicked. I thought someone was trying to take advantage of me, and when I saw you closing the gate, I snapped. I didn't know what else to do." Marcus listened, his anger softening just a little. Karen wasn't the villain here. She was just as caught up in this mess as he was. But there was still one question burning in his mind. "Karen, do you know why the city is looking into this? Do you know about the Johnsons?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I didn't know any of that. But now I think I understand why they called me. They wanted to see if I'd noticed anything, if I'd seen any signs, that something was wrong. But I didn't know what to look for. I didn't know any of this was happening." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in shadows, Marcus felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him or Karen anymore. This was about the Johnsons, about the history of this land, about the injustices that had been buried for decades. And now it was all coming to the surface. But the question remained, what would happen next? Would the city come clean about its past? Would Marcus and Karen be able to make things right? Or would the truth be buried once again, lost to history? The stakes had never been higher, and as the night closed in, one thing was certain. The climax of this story was coming, and when it did, it would change everything. Stay tuned, because The truth is about to be revealed, and no one is ready for what's coming next. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a sense of purpose. The weight of the past few days, the confrontation, the discovery of the Johnson story, the tension with Karen, had left him exhausted, but also determined. He couldn't let this go. Not now. Not after everything he'd learned. He called James, and together they decided to take action. They would go to the city offices and demand answers. No more runarounds, no more vague notices. They needed the truth, and they needed it now. Karen, too, had spent the night wrestling with her conscience. She knew she'd made mistakes, but she also knew she couldn't sit back and do nothing. When Marcus called her and told her about their plan, she didn't hesitate. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "This is my mess too, and I need to help fix it." The three of them arrived at the city offices early, their determination evident in their expressions. They asked to speak to someone in charge, and after a tense wait, they were ushered into a small conference room. A woman in her 50s, wearing a sharp suit and a no-nonsense expression, introduced herself as the city's legal advisor. "I understand you have some concerns about a property line dispute," she said, her tone polite but guarded. Marcus didn't mince words. He laid out everything they'd discovered: the Johnson story, the historical records, the vague notice Karen had received. "We're not leaving until we get answers," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about a gate or a property line. This is about justice, about doing what's right." The woman listened carefully, her expression unreadable. When Marcus finished, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. "You're right," she said finally. "This isn't just about a property line. It's about something much bigger." She paused, as if weighing her words, then continued. "The city has been investigating historical property records for the past year, trying to identify cases where families were wrongfully displaced due to discriminatory practices. The Johnsons' case is one of many. We've been working quietly to rectify these injustices, but it's a complicated process. There are legal hurdles, financial considerations. It's not something we can fix overnight." Marcus felt a surge of hope. "So you're saying the city is trying to make things right?" The woman nodded. "Yes, but it's not just about returning land or paying reparations. It's about acknowledging the past and ensuring it never happens again. That's why we sent out those notices, to gather information, to see if there were any living descendants who might have a claim to the land." Karen spoke up then, her voice trembling but resolute. "I didn't know any of this. I thought it was just a property issue. I didn't realize there was so much history behind it." The woman gave her a sympathetic look. "Most people don't. But now that you do, you have a chance to be part of the solution." For a moment, the room was silent as the weight of the situation sank in. Then Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locked on the woman's. "What happens next? What do we need to do?" She smiled faintly. "We're already in contact with the Johnsons' descendants. They've been informed about the investigation, and they're eager to see justice done. As for you, Marcus, your property is part of the land that was wrongfully taken. We're prepared to offer you a settlement, or if you prefer, the option to transfer ownership back to the Johnsons' family. It's your choice." Marcus sat back, stunned. He hadn't expected this. He'd come here demanding answers, but he hadn't anticipated being part of the solution. He looked at James, then at Karen, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. I need to think about it," he said finally. "But whatever happens, I want to make sure the Johnsons' story is told. People need to know what happened here." The woman nodded. "We'll make sure of it. This is just the beginning, but it's a step in the right direction." As they left the city offices, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: relief, hope, but also a lingering sense of unease. The truth had come out, but it had also opened up new questions, new challenges. What would he do about his property? How would the neighborhood react when they found out? And what would happen to Karen, who had been caught in the middle of all this? But as they walked back to the car, Karen surprised him. "Marcus, she said, her voice steady. I want to help. However I can. This is my neighborhood too, and I want to make sure we do right by the Johnsons. And by you. Marcus looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. For the first time, he felt like they were on the same side. All right, he said. Let's figure this out together. And then just when it seemed like the story was winding down, James dropped a bombshell. Hey, Marcus, he said, pulling out his phone. I just got a text from my cousin. He works at the newspaper. He says they're running a story tomorrow about the city's investigation, and they're naming names, people who were involved. In the original zoning laws back in the 50s. Some of them are still around. This is about to blow wide open. Marcus froze, his mind racing. If the story went public, it wouldn't just be about the Johnsons or his property. It would be about accountability, about exposing the people who had perpetuated these injustices. And that meant things were about to get a lot more complicated. As they drove back to the neighborhood, the tension in the car was palpable. The truth had come out, but the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Stay tuned, because while the climax has arrived, the fallout is just beginning. And in a story like this, the ending is never what you expect. The next few days were a whirlwind. The newspaper story broke, just as James had predicted, and it sent shockwaves through the community. Names were named, histories were uncovered, and the city's dark past was laid bare for everyone to see. People who had lived in the neighborhood for decades were stunned to learn about the injustices that had taken place right under their noses. For Marcus, it was both vindicating and overwhelming. The truth was out, but it came with a flood of emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of responsibility to make things right. Marcus decided to meet with the Johnsons' descendants. It wasn't an easy decision, but he knew it was the right one. He reached out through the city's legal advisor, and a meeting was arranged. When the day came, Marcus felt a mix of nerves and determination. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he had to face this head-on. The meeting took place at a small community center, a neutral space where everyone could feel comfortable. Marcus arrived early, accompanied by James and Karen. When the Johnsons family walked in, Marcus felt a lump in his throat. There were 3 of them, a woman in her 60s named Evelyn, her son David, and her niece Tamara. They greeted Marcus with cautious smiles, and after a few awkward moments, they all sat down together. Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak. I just want to say, I had no idea about any of this until a few days ago. But now that I know, I want to do whatever I can to make things right. This land, my home, it belongs to your family, and I want you to have it back. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. Thank you, she said softly. That means more than you know, but this isn't just about the land. It's about the history, the pain, the loss. My grandparents worked so hard to build a life here, and it was taken from them. No amount of land or money can undo that. But what you're doing, it's a start. The conversation that followed was emotional and raw. Evelyn shared stories about her grandparents, about the life they'd built and the heartbreak they'd endured when they were forced to leave. Marcus listened, his heart heavy but also filled with a sense of purpose. By the end of the meeting, they'd reached an agreement. Marcus would transfer ownership of the property back to the Johnsons' family, and the city would provide financial compensation to both parties to help ease the transition. As they left the community center, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Nothing could undo the past. But it was a step toward justice, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. Karen, too, had been deeply affected by the meeting. She'd stayed quiet for most of it, but as they walked back to the car, she turned to Marcus. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. For everything. I was so caught up in my own fears, my own biases. I didn't see the bigger picture, but now I do. And I want to help however I can. Marcus nodded, giving her a small smile. We all make mistakes, he said. What matters is what we do next. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to heal. The city held a public forum to address the historical injustices and outline their plans for reparations. It wasn't easy. There were heated debates, tough conversations, and a lot of emotions, but it was a start. Marcus and Karen became unlikely allies, working together to educate their neighbors and advocate for change. They organized community events, shared the Johnson story, and pushed for the city to do more to address its past. James, ever the behind-the-scenes hero, used his connections to keep the story in the news, ensuring that the pressure on the city didn't let up. "This isn't just about one family or one neighborhood," he said. "This is about setting a precedent, making sure this never happens again." As for Marcus, he found a new sense of purpose. He'd always been a quiet, private person, but now he felt compelled to speak out, to use his voice to make a difference. He started a blog sharing his journey and the lessons he'd learned along the way. It wasn't easy, putting himself out there, facing criticism and backlash, but he knew it was important. The Johnsons' family, too, found a measure of closure. They didn't move back to the neighborhood. Too much had changed, too much time had passed. But they visited often, reconnecting with the land that had once been theirs. Evelyn even planted a tree in her grandparents' memory, a symbol of resilience and hope. In the end, the story wasn't just about a gate or a property line. It was about history, about justice, about the power of truth. It was about a community coming together to right a wrong, to honor the past while building a better future. And it was about people, flawed, complicated, but ultimately capable of change. As Marcus stood in his driveway one evening, looking at the gate that had started it all, he felt a sense of pride. He'd been through hell, but he'd come out stronger. And he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he could face them, because he wasn't alone. He had his friends, his neighbors, and a community that had proven it could rise above its past. The story of Marcus, Karen, and the Johnsons' family became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, change is possible. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely is, but it was a meaningful one. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, casting a golden glow over the streets, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And so the story ends, not with a bang, but with a quiet sense of hope. Because sometimes the most powerful endings are the ones that remind us of our capacity for growth, for forgiveness, and for change. Thank you for following this journey. If this story has taught us anything, it's that the past may shape us, but it doesn't define us. The future is ours to write, and together we can make it a better one.